Welcome to the Queens of Quality, episode 3. We are going to talk about the regulatory landscape.
I find this one really interesting.
Why is that?
Well, being in a regulated environment, I take for granted, admittedly. I know we've talked in previous episodes that I'm not perfect. I take for granted that people understand the regulatory landscape of our business. And I have come to appreciate that that's not necessarily the case. So I find this one to be a really interesting and fun conversation and topic because I feel like it's something that not a lot of people really appreciate the complexities of it all.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited.
All right, so we can talk about a couple of different points here.
Okay.
What we took for granted in the pre-COVID world
Uh-huh.
and the things that had the most impact on you as a quality compliance professional. So let's start there.
Sure. Okay. So you mentioned the pre-COVID world.
Yes.
It's really interesting that once COVID hit, a lot of the people outside of the industry that I know now actually understand what I do. Because I've had conversations again, because rightly so, none of us have been through a global pandemic before. Very few of us have lived, long enough to be through 2 global pandemics. So the question was like, how is this all actually going to work? And the health authorities worked really closely with the pharmaceutical companies and the biotech companies that developed the vaccines. And all of the same things still happened. It just happened in a very collaborative way. There's still all of the data, there's still all of the participants. Normally, well, taking the vaccines as an example, tens of thousands of people volunteered. And I know people who struggle to get 200 people for their trials, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So obviously the awareness was there. We were all living in it. So that's where I think, from a personal standpoint, the people in my day-to-day life have a better understanding of what it is I actually do and how the pharmaceutical industry actually works.
Yes.
And I love the fact that I would get phone calls going, what do you think about this? And how did that work? I saw this on the news and it's like, okay, so it was actually a really nice, it ended up being a bonding experience in many ways that I didn't expect.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about you?
I think that there also I also had that experience with the clarity around what it is that we actually do, because this was kind of an open crash course in how products are developed.
Right.
And we were also from a professional standpoint, like we were able to see in real life how much the process has changed since the development of the polio vaccine and everything that had to go through and the timelines for that, and how things have really shored up as advancements in scientific research, as advancements in bench research.
Yep.
how that has really pushed to where we can develop vaccines in a much shorter time frame to address
Right.
a global pandemic.
Yep.
And we're not through it yet. I think that it's really important that we note that we are not, like, COVID
Good point.
isn't done.
Right.
Um, and we also have, to go back to that theme of continuous improvement, right?
Right.
We know things that didn't work. And it's not necessarily major fail points, but there are tweaks that can be made that can make it go smoother.
Right.
Exciting pieces. This was the first time that we used mRNA for vaccine. That is giant.
Right.
And from the process standpoint, it makes for more effective use of the technologies that we've developed.
Agreed. Yeah. I'm actually really excited. Okay, I would have loved for it not to have taken a global pandemic to get there.
Right.
And I find that it'll be a springboard to get to so many other things,
Yes.
and have it be leveraged for so many other conditions, issues, disorders. Again, I'm really looking forward to see what those who are more creative and more intelligent and more knowledgeable about the science, the atomic science of it,
Right.
than I am. So I can tell you what the regulatory requirements are.
And that's actually, so
That's
we
part of
are
my
here.
that's my job on the team, is to tell you what they're
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And I think that that also made for, um, you know, the pieces that we do, talking about the regulatory
Mhm.
science of it and the regulatory pieces, seeing where they connect
Right.
is also something I think that, I worked in pharmacovigilance for a very long time. And, we always used to joke about that, nobody actually knew what PV was until the inspectors came. And then
Right.
all of a sudden everybody's tripping over the PV.
Right.
And it's very similar with regulatory.
Mhm.
Regulatory is kind of a foreign concept for a lot of people, even within the industry. They
Right.
they don't they don't get where the piece that they do connects to the regulatory piece. And it is such that there's so many building blocks, right, within the organization.
Right.
And all of the building blocks point to what we're going for is regulatory submission. What we're
Right.
going for is approval of the product. And each piece plays a critical point.
Mhm. I had a conversation with someone when I was in house, and there were questions around the regulatory interpretation of something. And the comment was, "Why is quality here? We need regulatory." And I was like, "Oh."
Right.
I'm like, help me understand, where did you get to that conclusion? Well, this is about the regulatory requirements. I'm like, uh-huh. And it was the regulatory requirements for, the development of certain things. And I was like, oh, interesting. Okay. You know, where I just kind of took a pause. I was like, sure, regulatory knows what the GXPs are, the GCPs are, and, that kind of thing. But they generally talk about the regulatory strategy versus the interpretation of the regulations.
Right.
and they have that immediate connection, generally speaking, with the health authorities, like in that day-to-day work, for lack of a better term. Whereas when it's an inspection, it's usually the quality organization who ends up hosting.
Exactly.
And that's where it was really kind of like, oh, I found out later that this was actually their first industry job. And I was like, okay, well, that kind of helps, because I was like, it was so habitual for me, and just my, it was my normal, right? So then I just was kind of like, I'm surprised this is a question, kind of thing. And I was like, oh, I have to really kind of take a pause and figure out how to actually explain that kind of thing. And that's, it was an interesting conversation, and, they appreciated ultimately while I was there, but it was just kind of like, oh, okay. And, I've been in a PV organization as well. And it's the same kind of, conversation, when I talk with people about, adverse event reporting, and like, oh, well, it's a PV inspection, why does my patient support program matter? And it's like, oh, okay, right. Got it. So it's like, everybody works in safety information. Everybody works in, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So, but how the products get developed and how they get approved, more importantly, because the ultimate goal is always approval, like, how does that actually work? And I had a situation once where I was very fortunate in that I got to do a continuing education seminar of sorts, at a very reputable public health school in Boston. And there were a lot of students there who were not native English speakers, and they were from different countries. That they were international students. And I was going through the regulatory landscape, of, this is who the WHO is. This is who the United Nations are. This is who, the FDA is, and this is how they connect to human health services, and, kind of going through the structural piece of the regulatory environment, and someone asked a very telling question, in that they asked, when the application is submitted, why do people generally not come to my country? And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because the perception was that there was an application, and that there was one application, and that you use the same application, for each health authority. And I was like, oh, that's actually, so it completely took us in a different direction, and they had to reel me in. And it was a great conversation, even though they knocked on my door and say, Jen, it's time for you to go. But it really spoke to me a lot, because there's so many different aspects that go into where you submit your application, where you do your clinical trials, and how all of that fits together ultimately in the goal of getting approval.
Yeah. And I view regulatory as being very much like quality, in that they are an integral part of the foundation that's built, and an integral part of the framework that's built, and an integral part of the overarching, going back to the previous episode where we talked about the house analogy, it's the overarching umbrella,
right?
That
they're part of the strategy.
That's part of the strategy. And Also, going back to that first episode, we're looking for quality and compliance in all of the pieces that go into that quality and the regulatory framework.
Right.
Because the ultimate goal, yes, is approval. And the ultimate, recipient of that is the patient.
Right. And to your point, the safety and well-being of the subjects who participate in the trials,
Mhm.
and the patients who will take the product ultimately after approval is paramount. And that's where I think leveraging some of your regulatory colleagues ends up being a really a really good strategy, because they have the insights. They are experts in, especially if you're talking different geographies,
Right,
they have the nuances and they understand the nuances as to what that particular health authority is looking for,
right.
and they know how long it's going to take approval. Like we talked, at the beginning about, with COVID, who would not love to be able to have a product go from development to approval in 18 months? You know,
Right.
that is unheard of, and that's because all of the materials being reviewed got moved to the front of the line.
Yep.
And they had the conversations on a daily basis and everything else that went along with it. You know, they had direct line, the developers had a direct line to the health authority.
Mhm.
That never happens. So again, like how do you try to minimize your time on hold? It's like when you make a phone call, like, you have to listen to that music, how do you
Right.
minimize your time on hold? You know,
Yeah.
and it's not because, your product and your therapeutic area isn't important kind of thing. It's just obviously, anything COVID got priority. Um, but that's where again, trying to make those decisions and understanding when to submit and where to submit
Yes.
is really critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so, to kind of delve a little deeper into the regulatory landscape, what you were saying about that the regulatory function within organizations understand the nuances. What I like to use it as an example of that is the EMA,
Mhm.
because there are multiple countries
Right.
under EMA, and there are nuances from country to country. Like these are the overarching regulations, and each country has a slightly different facet that, for um, literature search is
Mhm.
one area. Like there's a responsibility for local literature search in addition to global.
The global literature. Yeah.
So it's important to be aware of that and to do proactive searches on that and to include that in the data on an ongoing basis, and don't wait until it's data lock time and you're getting ready to present the report to say, hey, we need to take a look at this data.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, that's where you find, oh, now we need to change this little bit, this little piece, this little
Right.
piece.
Yeah.
Um, so
And rightly so. A lot of countries expect data specific to their cultural population.
yes,
You
yes,
know, And as much as, as human beings, we have moved around the planet, there are still specific concentrations, of um, genetic differences.
Yes.
It's just different.
Yep.
So what does that look like? And depending on how sensitive the product is, the metabolites, the diet has been huge in,
Yes.
in understanding people's diets in terms of the development and efficacy and adverse events that happen, you
Absolutely.
know?
And we see that with, lines of products that are available on the market right now. If you
Right,
look at SSRIs,
right. Yep.
people react very differently
Uh-huh.
to different SSRIs.
Right. Yep.
Um, some work really well for certain populations,
Uh-huh.
and some don't work at all.
Right. Yep.
Um, and that can go into whole other topics about, biosimilars and,
Right. Yeah.
developing drugs for specific people,
Uh-huh.
a specific cocktail.
Right. Yeah. But that's
Um,
where Mhm.
but we don't have that luxury, and we don't have that capability at this point to develop products for a specific person.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I've seen projections about, the personalization of products and that kind of thing, based on your personal genetic code. And I think that's fascinating.
It is.
It's a great idea. And when I think about, you know, the business aspects of it,
Right.
it's like, okay, well, is there really going to be a company that's willing to develop something for Jen DeMarco?
Yeah.
Because we all know how expensive it is to develop a product, right? It's like, okay, well, if it's for Jen DeMarco, there's a higher likelihood that it's actually going to be successful because it's just one person, not, what are we at? Like 300 billion people
Right.
on the planet, kind of thing. But that's where, I come back to the conversation I had in that continuing education session. It really, we started to talk a lot about the economics of it too, in addition to the the practicalities of it. Like once they realized that it was not a one size fits all kind of scenario, it's like, and I said, yeah, I think it's a great, it'd be great if, we can get more products into their country because their country is very underserved, the person who asked the question. You know, that being said, it costs money to go here and here and here and submit everywhere. And, even as healthcare professionals, they were not aware that you actually have to pay a fee to submit
Right.
in addition to all of the other development.
Exactly.
And they were like, oh, like, so it made more sense now why it wasn't submitted in their country, in a sooner than later fashion.
Right.
But that's where, again, it was like that just the lack of awareness that that's actually a thing,
Yep.
you know?
And we hear a lot of complaints about that in the US as well, regarding, drugs that are approved in, you know, Canada, the EU, Mexico, that are not available in the US and have not yet been approved by the FDA.
Mhm.
And cost is certainly a factor, and there are multiple other factors as well. So, these are all things that need to be taken into consideration.
Right. Yeah. And again, more often than not, the people that I've worked with, I should say, it's generally the regulatory affairs organization that I would go to say, you know, what happens there kind of
Right.
thing, you
Yeah.
know, and if we're, or, having worked in a PV department,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, we have a new business partner in this area,
Yes.
this geography, how do we interact with them so that they can appropriately interact with their health authority kind of thing,
Yeah.
you know, and it's, those kinds of pieces that I think, again, are just not well understood within the industry as a whole,
Yeah.
because we don't talk about it. I know I keep referring back to our original episode about the lines of communication, you know,
Yeah.
and appreciating what our other colleagues do, but understanding how all of the pieces are really connected,
Right.
whether it's the WHO and the health authorities, or whether it's your regulatory organization and your quality organization,
Yes.
and how you partner together, and what that really looks like is not always well understood.
Right.
It also assumes it's well defined.
Yeah. Understood and defined are also two very different,
Yes.
very different pieces.
Right. Yes. And it's interesting. I don't want to say it's funny, but it's interesting when I have conversations with clients when they say, oh, do we really have to do that regulatory requirement? Because we're in such and such um therapeutic area, or we're in such and such, like, there's only, 25 of this kind of thing, you know, and it's like, well, the requirements are the requirements, the health authorities have not given any sort of forgivance for size of organization or altruistic approach in what you
Right.
want to, and what populations you want to treat,
Yeah.
you know. So that's where, again, having that line, those lines of communication open, and that understanding as to how all the pieces fit together helps ultimately with making those informed decisions about how you want to develop, where you want to develop, where you want to have your clinical trials, where do you want to submit your application first, because that's how you're able to set yourself up for success. Because if you assume that you don't have to do X, Y, and Z because your company's small, you know, that will not set you up for success.
Right. And that's,
Mhm,
really, we've talked about several different points
mhm,
through the, now 3 episodes of this podcast. And
right.
that's really what I think are the crux of our message is that we really want to set people up for success. We
Absolutely.
want everyone to be successful. And even when we're delivering not the best news,
Right.
it's not, it's because to we, we want to help them fix it,
Right.
and we want them to be successful.
Right.
This is the goal, right?
Mhm,
Is for us all to be successful.
mhm. And I know that you and I have talked about this offline or outside of the podcast about, ensuring that people have solutions that are fit for purpose.
Yes, absolutely.
you know, and I've seen it quite a few times when, again, you work for a really large organization that is very well established and has all of the infrastructure. And then they move to a very teeny tiny biotech with 15 people.
Right.
And they know the regulatory requirements, which is good because they've been in the industry for, 20, 30, 40 years kind of thing,
Yes.
you know, and rightly so, because they've had armies of people within their organizations, you know, they know it has to get done, but they don't know actually how to do it,
Right.
or they may not even know that it has to get done. I call that the gnomes and fairies, you know, You know, the the garden becomes beautiful. You just don't know how it happens. You know,
Right.
you just know that it's beautiful, right? But that's where again those communications and understanding that all of this is connected. And somebody somewhere along the line, or it was set up for success because you were able to be in that role and that stayed with that company for so long, kind of thing. But now you're in this teeny tiny, how do you set them up for success now?
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
and I've worked with the smaller organizations, under 50 people, and they're like, oh well, you know, we don't really train. It's like, well, you still have to train. You have to be able to demonstrate. It doesn't mean you need to spend $5 million on an LMS.
Yes,
It means you just need to be able to demonstrate it.
right.
And they're like, oh, okay, because they had that person who came in and like, oh, well, I only use that system, so I want to use that system.
Exactly.
And that's fine. I mean, it's absolutely reasonable. You come in, you're comfortable with something, it, you can, hit the ground running, as it were, right? You might not have the $5 million to spend on the implementation, and
Exactly.
you're one of 15. Is that really practical? Probably not,
Right. Yeah.
and
So what do we do then?
exactly.
You adjust.
Right.
And
You,
the smaller organizations, they're not necessarily looking to become
bigger organizations.
the giant organization
Right.
that you came from, and really insert any huge company here.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Right.
that's the way we did it at this place. Well, you know what?
Right.
The
We're not a
solutions we found,
multinational company with a cajillion.
right?
We're not in the S&P 500. Like,
Yes,
we're not even IPO. Like, we're pre-IPO.
exactly, exactly.
you know.
And we joke about it because we've been there and we've seen it,
Mm-hmm.
and we know this part. It's
Mm-hmm.
not unfamiliar to us.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's good to not always have that.
Right.
Like it's good to have the experience of
Mm-hmm.
doing something different.
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why I love what I do, is that creative piece of, developing solutions that'll work for them,
Yes, exactly.
you
That
know,
is
under the regulatory umbrella. you know, I work with clients. They're like, okay, we only, we're working in the EU, we're working in Africa, we're working in anywhere who will have us, kind of thing,
yes,
and, or we're only working in the US. And again, all of those things matter when you're developing solutions,
absolutely.
you know, and I had a conversation recently with a client, and I, I asked the CEO, I said, so are you looking to grow, or you're looking to sell? And he got really uncomfortable really fast. And it was kind of like, what, I wasn't looking for trade secrets or anything like that. And if the board or the company, the C suite already had an idea of where they wanted to go, that's going to impact the kind of solutions I develop for them.
Absolutely.
Because I'm not going to recommend spending $5 million on an LMS, to kind of stick with that example. If they're looking to, get through this phase and sell the asset,
Right.
you know, if they're looking to continue to grow and expand, and they want to go from, small to medium, then maybe not now, but maybe next year. Think about, like, because you are in a growth spurt, think about adding that, $5 million to your budget for that thing, and the infrastructure, as you talk about, go back to the house, right? To develop the infrastructure to support it all.
And that all translates also to the regulatory landscape,
Right.
because that LMS system is going to have regulatory impact. And so
Right.
you want the regulatory person or team to
Mhm.
be involved with those decisions around what kind of pieces you're implementing, where does it fit, what are the interfaces, how is
Right.
this going to have an impact down the road?
Right. Yep.
What does it look like?
Right.
And so that's, I also, in asking clients, like where they are, where they want to be, like,
Mhm.
where do you want to be in 6 months? Where do you want to be in 12 months? Where do you want to be in a year? What about 5 years?
Mhm. Yep.
What's the goal?
Yep. I love that you say that because I have those conversations as well because it's like, okay, 6, 24, and 60,
Yeah.
and they, it's funny because now I have clients saying it to me, which is great. You know what I mean? Like, all right, Jen, we're just talking about 6 months. We don't care about 60 yet. I'm like, okay, great. You know,
Yep.
you know, so because again, it all matters,
Yes.
and to know, like, even, ICH has, been updating, to R3 kind of thing, you know, those kinds of things, you have to prepare for them,
Yeah.
and that's where, again, like the regulatory landscape piece really matters,
Yes.
you know, one of the biggest projects I worked on and how I, really, enmeshed myself into the PV space was when the EMA released the GVP modules.
Yes.
You know, that was a huge undertaking. I worked very closely with my regulatory colleagues,
Yeah.
and how do we want to work this? How are we going to implement this kind of thing? So again, it's not just how the pieces fit together, but it's also how the land shifts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Luckily, it's not usually a landslide. It's usually kind of a, they don't generally move fast.
Right.
But that's where your 6, 24, and 60 plans come into play.
Yep.
And those are months, by the way. I
Yes.
didn't actually say that. They're months. Mhm.
I get that.
Yeah, I know you get that. I'm glad you get my speak.
This is why we play together.
Exactly. And, we talked about, speaking the same language. So there you go, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, so
All
it
right.
definitely impacts the the regulatory landscape impacts so much of the development life cycle and the business decisions that you make as well.
Yes.
So, yeah. I mean, I really like the fact that we talked about today the landscape in and of itself and how so many people who, I don't know if we can call them experts, but they definitely know more about development and and the regulatory landscape associated with that, because of COVID.
Right.
Not to say that, again, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and it's the world we live in today. You know, um, and it sparked some really interesting conversations, and I to kind of, like, sum up the previous parts of the conversation, I'm really looking forward to see what mRNA will do for the industry as a whole and how
Right.
that changes the landscape, you know, and how the collaborative efforts between industry and the regulators helped facilitate getting things done.
And between companies. Like, I think that
Exactly.
we've seen more cooperation between business partners
Mhm.
with this
Yep.
because of the recognition of
Mhm.
the severity of the global pandemic.
Exactly. Yep. And then, appreciating that, the regulatory landscape shifts, and that's where, again, leveraging your regulatory department, and their expertise to understand the nuances, as you make your development decisions is, again, definitely something to definitely a team you want to partner with.
Yes,
Did I forget anything? I know we talked about lots of different things today.
we did. It's been a big day. I think that we're pretty good. So to recap for this part of today, we talked about regulatory landscape and how all the pieces fit together. So again, please feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about. Spread the word. And thank you so much for playing along with us.
Thanks,
And for
Michelleanne.
keeping me. Thank you.